Well, Bill, I've told you before that I've spent hours watching your YouTube debates, probably too many hours. So it's really a privilege to be able to talk today about your book on the Atonement and the Death of Christ from Baylor University Press, just out this year. And I wanted to ask, what led you to this topic? Because I've followed your career over the years and you've had different points of focus. What made you want to do research on the Atonement?
I'm currently engaged in writing a systematic philosophical theology, and I realized that to tackle such an ambitious project, I would have to bone up on certain areas of theology that I was weak in. And one of these was atonement theory. And so I decided prior to writing this systematic theology that I would study the atonement in depth. And it turned out to be a very, very richly rewarding experience. I learned so much and came to appreciate this doctrine with new insight and depth.
Mm. Well, one of the things that I really appreciated about the book is you have these three different sections: Bible, historical theology, and I'm going to say thanks in just a few moments for how you treated Anselm.
Oh, good.
Because he's my favorite theologian of all time. And as you point out, I think
Wow.
he's often caricatured in the
Yes.
contemporary literature on the atonement, how he treats that, but also the philosophical treatment. And as a theologian, I really took that to heart, because you're bringing these things together. And I think you're right that many times theologians don't engage a doctrine like the atonement with a philosophical sensitivity. So could you just unpack a little bit about why it's important to have that philosophical sensitivity when we engage a doctrine like the atonement?
One of the things that philosophy is most useful for is what's called conceptual analysis. That is to say, analyzing concepts. And I find over and over again that biblical scholars who are untrained in philosophy make conceptual mistakes. For example, there's a conceptual difference between conceiving of death as a consequence of sin as opposed to a punishment for sin. And the way you think of death is vastly different if you think of it in terms of a punishment as opposed to a consequence. Or another example would be the idea of justice. Many biblical scholars don't understand the difference between retributive theories of justice and consequentialist theories of justice, and as a result, become confused in their theological work. Or just one more example, the very idea of penal substitution, I think, is very subtle conceptually. I would say that penal substitution is the view that Christ bore the suffering which we deserved as the punishment for our sins, thereby freeing us from liability to punishment. And if that's right, that leaves it an open question as to whether God punished Christ for our sins. Some would say yes, others would say no, but he did bear the suffering which would have been punishment had it been inflicted on us, because it would have been our just desert. So, in all of these different ways and more, conceptual analysis is just vital for doing good biblical and theological studies. The other reason it's valuable is, quite honestly, I think that the most important objections to many atonement theories are not biblical, they are philosophical. And because biblical theologians are not familiar with philosophical reasoning and argumentation, they will often abandon doctrines that I think are biblically very solidly grounded, because they're persuaded by these philosophical arguments. And so, by having a good handle on the philosophical arguments, it can help us, I think, to do a better job in terms of theological formulation and defense of biblical doctrine.
Yeah, and you also point out in the other direction, when
Mm.
philosophers neglect church history and biblical studies, they can fall into errors in that vein as well. So we can talk about that in just a moment. But
Yes, that I feel very strongly about that. I think that too often my Christian philosophical colleagues are untrained in biblical studies. They don't know the biblical languages, they don't know the biblical material well. And this comes out very clearly in work on the atonement. The way that contemporary Christian philosophers craft theories of the atonement is by beginning with human relationships. For example, say a falling out between two friends. And they then ask, how is it that reconciliation is achieved in these human relationships between two friends?
Mm.
And I think what they fail to understand is that the relationship between God and human beings is vastly different than the relationship between two human persons. Biblically, God is not a private person involved in a personal dispute. Rather, he is the judge and ruler of the universe, responsible for maintaining the moral order of the universe. And this affects how you view divine forgiveness, divine reconciliation, and a host of other issues. So, this would be an example where Christian atonement theories have just completely gone off the rails because they are frankly unbiblical. They are built on human relationships, and therefore, however congenial they might be, just are not Christian theories of the atonement.
Yeah, that would be one of the ways I could express what I appreciated about your book is it's showing how fruitful it can be to bring these different disciplines together
Mhm.
and have them interact with each other. And one of the aims of your book is to give defense to the notion of penal substitution. And I wanted to ask, why do you think that doctrine is so controversial? Because it seems to me that people really get concerned about this. And I want to read about an older quote. This is from George Smeaton. He said this all the way back in 1870. So in the 19th century, this doctrine was also very controversial. And he said, the question of divine wrath is at present the great point in debate on the subject of the atonement. And I'm curious, do you think that a discomfort with the idea of divine wrath is still a major factor in why penal substitution and other related objective models of the atonement can be so controversial? Or what do you think is causing this to be so controversial?
I think that is one factor, but not the only one, and perhaps not even the most important one. Smeaton wrote during the heyday of classical liberal theology,
Mm.
and the emphasis of liberal theology was that God doesn't need to be reconciled to human beings. God stands with open arms, ready to forgive and to embrace. Rather, it is human beings that need to be reconciled to God. And biblically speaking, there's some justification for this. Whenever reconciliation is used in the New Testament, it is a plea for human beings to be reconciled to God. Um, but that ignores the equally clear teaching that God is wrathful about sin, that he hates sin, and that he sides with the victims of injustice and abuse and violence and so forth. If God were emotionally indifferent to the victims of suffering, what sort of God would that be? And I think that the contemporary aversion to divine wrath is the lingering vestige of classical liberal theology. I think that although liberal theology has been largely eclipsed, that is one of its central elements that has persisted today. So that theologians think that reconciliation needs to come entirely from the human side and nothing from the divine side. And so the wrath of God is denied, despite the good biblical teaching on that.
In the book, you point out how classical accounts of the atonement are often caricatured. So when you read someone like Anselm,
Mm.
the medieval theologian, or the church fathers, you often get a different picture, sometimes a very different picture than when you read secondary
Yes.
literature about these figures. And I was just curious for you to comment on that a little bit, and maybe what surprised you the most as you waded into church history on the atonement.
Over and over again, Gavin, I was shocked and frankly incensed at the way these great men of God in the past were caricatured and lampooned by the secondary literature.
Mhm.
Perhaps the greatest surprise to me was with respect to the church fathers. I've always been taught that the church fathers were addicted to the ransom theory of the atonement, that God sent Jesus Christ as a ransom to Satan to free us as hostages from bondage. But Satan couldn't hold Christ because he was divine, and that therefore he broke the bonds of death and hell and Satan himself. And it turns out that when you read Eusebius and Origen and Augustine and Chrysostom, on and on, this is not the only view of the atonement they held. You will find motifs of ransom theory as well as penal substitution, sacrifice, satisfaction. All of these different elements are to be found in the church fathers that are found in the New Testament. And therefore, it's a terrible caricature to portray the church fathers as unanimously and monochromatically committed to a Christus Victor or ransom theory of the atonement.
One of the areas where there can be a danger, and you point this out in the book, is bringing a false dichotomy. So saying that, setting one motif regarding the atonement at odds with another when they are potentially complementary to each other. So could you talk about how penal substitution relates to other aspects of the atonement and kind of what that
Yes.
logical relationship is?
I think that penal substitution helps to explain many of the other motifs. For example, take the idea of Christus Victor, victory over sin and death and hell. I think that this is explained by the fact that Christ satisfied the demands of divine justice on our behalf so that God can issue a legal pardon to us that absolves us from guilt and constitutes us new creations in his sight. So that redemption is actually achieved through penal substitution. Similarly, in penal substitution, we see both the depth of God's love, the extent to which he would bear extreme suffering for our sake, and we see the depth of God's holiness as his just judgment is poured out upon Christ uh, for our sin. And this then can be a moral influence on us as we contemplate the love and the holiness of God, what it cost him to win our redemption. And that will kindle within our hearts a love for him so that the moral influence of the atonement or the cross is explained through penal substitution.
Let me read a quote. This is from a book called The Nonviolent Atonement by Denny Weaver. And he's
Mhm.
arguing against Anselm's account of the atonement, but I think it would be applicable to any objective account of the atonement. It would apply to many expressions of penal substitution as well. And the concern here is about violence and the effect of our atonement theology on standing up for victims, standing against abuse, and that kind of thing. And I'm curious how you would respond to this. He says, Anselm's atonement image is one of passive, innocent suffering that is owed to God. Such an atonement image is unhealthy for human beings, in particular, those who have experienced oppression. And he goes on to unpack how holding up this ideal of a passive submission to violence is dangerous.
Mhm.
And I'm curious how you'd respond to that. It's the sort of objection that feels like it needs both
Yeah.
an intellectual response and a pastoral response at the same time. But how would you interact with that worry?
I would say that he's mischaracterized Anselm's theory. It is not true on Anselm's theory that this is a suffering which was owed. In fact, it is the exact opposite. Because Christ was sinless, he owed nothing to God for his sin. He had no sin, so he didn't have to die. So, what that means is that Christ's death was a self giving, voluntary sacrifice on our behalf. He voluntarily gave his life to save you and me. It would be like someone who uh, gives up his life to rescue a drowning child and gets that child to safety at the expense of sacrificing his own life. So once you understand that Christ's gift of his own life was unowed and utterly voluntary and motivated by love, it puts the atonement in a completely different light. It is a supreme self-giving sacrifice out of love.
Mhm. One of the things I found so helpful about your book was the concept of legal fictions. And I found that so
Uh,
fascinating. And just in general, the philosophy of law and how relevant
yeah,
that is to this topic and to responding to some of the objections. So I thought perhaps you could give a few examples of legal fictions or just
sure.
some discussion of how this ties into the atonement.
Yes, the idea here is that it is a very common practice in courts of law for the court to adopt a legal fiction for the sake of a particular action before the court. A legal fiction is something that the court knows to be false, but nevertheless, it is adopted as an assumption on which then to base the action. And in the case of the atonement, I think the legal fiction that God, as the supreme judge, might adopt would be that Christ committed these sins for which he is then punished, rather than us. Obviously, Christ is sinless. He could not commit sin. And yet, God adopted for the purposes of our redemption the legal fiction that Christ had committed these sins rather than us, so that he might then be justly punished in our place. In 19th century maritime law, the legal fiction was adopted that ships are persons. And this allowed the authorities to intercept smugglers and even slave traders, to impound their cargoes and free the slaves, because the ship was held to be the wrongdoer. And this became the settled practice in maritime law. Another famous example is Mastron versus Fabregas, where uh, Mr. Fabregas was a resident of the Mediterranean island of Minorca, which was then under British control. And he sued the governor of Minorca for unlawful arrest and imprisonment. The problem was the suit couldn't proceed in Minorca without the approval of the governor himself, who was being sued. And so, what Mr. Fabregas did was he brought suit in the Court of Common Pleas back in London. And Lord Mansfield, the judge in the case, realizing that justice was not going to be done in this case unless he adopted a legal fiction that for the purposes of this action, Minorca was part of London. And therefore, Mr. Fabregas counted as a resident of London and could successfully bring his suit. So, given the use of legal fictions in Anglo American law, there's perfect precedent for God adopting the legal fiction that Christ committed these sinful acts and therefore could be justly punished for them.
Bill, right now there are so many concerns about justice in the world. How would you speak to someone who is needing hope with respect to justice? What is the hope that is offered in the death of Christ for our concern for justice?
I think that what the atonement teaches us is that God is absolutely just and cannot be compromised. And this ought to be an encouragement for everyone who is a victim of injustice, because it means that God cares about your plight. Um, when God expresses his wrath upon sin, this is an expression of his care for the victims of injustice. A God who was passive and emotionally unmoved about the horrible injustices in this life would not be the God of the Bible. And so I think, as Steve Davis, a Christian philosopher, once put it, the wrath of God is our only hope, because it really shows that God cares about injustice and is therefore outraged with sin. Now, of course, the other side of that coin is that we ourselves are guilty of injustice and therefore need God's pardon and forgiveness and cleansing. But the good news of the gospel is that that also has been provided in the death of Christ, so that we ourselves can be pardoned of the wrongs that we do.
Wonderful. Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to talk today.
My pleasure, Gavin.